so the youth can go. Right, everybody, I want you to do me a favour first. Hold out both your hands like this. Put them all up, everybody. Everybody, great. Happy Palm Sunday. There we go. I've always wanted to do that. Right, so we're doing our series, we're continuing our series on Easter people from the Bible, and I was given an opportunity to preach one of these, and I thought, of course I'm going to do a baddie. Of course I am, and it could have been Judas, but it's not. It's Pilate. We're going to talk about Pontius Pilate this morning. So to start with, let's look from the Bible. John 18, 29 to 40. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the place of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanliness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man? If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we'd not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked. "Or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is it that you've done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then?" said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of the truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at a time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. So there we have it, a familiar story from the Bible, the Easter story. The phrase "suffered under Pontius Pilate" is well known. It's used in the Apostles' Creed. It's been translated into more languages than nearly any other name in history. We heard from Marilyn a couple of weeks ago about Thomas, who became known as Doubting Thomas, and talked about how Thomas must actually feel quite annoyed about that because lots of other people did lots of other things, but Thomas is always known about Doubting Thomas. And now we have poor old Pilate, who's probably also saying, well, lots of people made different decisions. I think I'm ringing quite a bit, am I? Am I ringing like a church bell? But, well, there we go. No, not unusual for me to sound funny. If I ring any more in church, I'll be in an episode of Midsummer Murders. Is there anything about that? No, fair enough. See, I've got to fit it back in my belt now, and it's under enough pressure. Watch out, front row, this could go at any time. There we go. But anyway, Pilate must feel a bit annoyed that he's always known as the baddie of the Easter story. We remember him once a year. And he stepped onto the stage of history for only about 4 hours, and his name's known to most people in the world. He didn't choose to get involved in the Passion of the Christ. So what do we know about Pilate? So a quick history lesson, because we know the name, but do we know anything else? He had a middle-class upbringing. He served in the Roman army in Germany. And while on a long stay in Rome, he caught the affection of a Roman girl called Claudia Procula. Am I going to switch off?
I'm going to give you this because it's driving me bonkers. I don't know about anybody else, but... No. Could you start again? Should we start again, just for the video? No, not at all.
Yeah, I've borrowed Helen's glasses. I left mine at home this morning. So, there you go. So, he caught the affection of a Roman girl called Claudia Procula. Now, she happened to be the granddaughter of someone you may know, Caesar Augustus. And because of this, he was given a position that otherwise he would never have been able to get. So in AD 26, he was appointed governor of Judea, and he got given the very unusual privilege. He was allowed to take his wife with him. Not sure, is that a privilege? Sorry. Sorry, yes. We are on the marriage course, I'm only joking, sorry. Oh, Sunday lunch is going to be awkward. Has anyone else got room? Anyway, sorry. So, and as governor, he was in charge of administering all aspects of Roman law. He was head of its judicial system. He collected taxes, he allocated spending and sent taxes to Rome. Now, Judea was bristling with problems during this time. There was stubborn resistance by the Jews towards what they saw as their Roman captors. There was constant rebellion and unrest. So governor of Judea wasn't a position that anybody really wanted. And it was considered, I'm afraid, to be the armpit of the Roman Empire. Although he was able to live in a palace with servants and soldiers, he had to deal with keeping the peace among the Jews, who were known as a fanatical people who only understood the whip. And there are diverse views still today about Pilate and who he was. For instance, the Ethiopian Coptic Church recognized Pontius Pilate and his wife Bacula as saints and observed the 25th of June in their honor. The early church father, Tertullian, believed Pilate was a Christian in his conscience, and the Greek Orthodox Church made Procula a saint, but not Pilate. Medieval legends say that Pilate was tortured, exiled, and compulsively washing his hands for the rest of his life. Several historians paint Pilate as a brutal despot who despised the Jewish people. The historian Philo writes of his venality, his violence, his thefts, his assaults, his abusive behavior, his frequent executions, and endless savage ferocity. So there's a few different opinions about who Pilate actually was. In one instance, we're told in history, Pilate decided Jerusalem needed a new water supply, and in order to finance it, he stole from the temple treasury. It's a good job politicians don't take money from one place to another place to pay for things, isn't it? Only in those days. The people were so incensed that they rioted on the streets, and as a result, Pilate had his soldiers dress as protesters, go out into the middle of the riot, and then slit the throats of as many people as they possibly could. There were other protests that he quelled by killing many people, including the leaders, especially peaceful protests. And atrocities, we're told by history, were the hallmarks of Pilate's rule, which only incited the Jews to riot further, which didn't please Caesar. Because if there was anything Rome wanted, it was peaceful rule. And Pilate was eventually called back to Rome in March 37 AD. And you might think, well, that's all very interesting, James, but what has this got to do with Easter? Well, I'm getting there, but I'm also auditioning for the History Channel. At the time of his encounter with Jesus, Pilate was really on the political hot seat. You know, we see politicians these days under a lot of pressure, incredibly unpopular, things going wrong. And that's where Pilate was. He'd got riots. He'd been called to Rome by Caesar to be told off about how he was doing a bad job. He couldn't afford any more trouble. So to make matters worse, when the Jews wished to fulfill the punishment of the law on their people, especially a death sentence, they had to go to Pilate so that the Romans could carry out the sentence. They weren't allowed to do it themselves. And that's why the religious leaders bring Jesus to Pilate on that fateful Friday morning. They know that his back is against the wall, and Caiaphas uses that to force Pilate's hand. He's stuck between the metaphorical rock and a hard place. The Sanhedrin, the Jewish ruling body enforcing Jewish law, seeking to maintain Israel's religious freedom, but to do that, they needed to stop the Jewish people from rioting. Pilate needed the Sanhedrin to keep the Jewish people in check. The Sanhedrin had reached a guilty verdict against Jesus and handed him over to Pilate. They want Jesus punished, and yet Pilate interviews him and finds him innocent. So if he didn't please the Jews, they'd riot, report to Rome, and Pilate would lose his job. If he didn't please his wife, well, you know the saying, happy wife, happy life. And she wanted Jesus to be released. So Pilate is in a situation where he either keeps his job and keeps the Jews happy, or upsets his wife and doesn't do what he probably thinks is the right thing to do. So what do we actually learn from Pilate? What can we take away this morning? Well, Pilate was what I know I can be quite a lot, a people pleaser. He was being walked over. Now you might ask this morning, what harm can it do to try and satisfy everyone? What can possibly be wrong with trying to make people happy? But this morning, we need to recognize that people-pleasing has spiritual consequences because its payoff is huge. If we're people-pleasers, we become deaf to the voice of God, we'll be blind to the guidance of God, and we'll never find the strength to obey God. People-pleasers are in open season for sin, and that's serious. Pontius Pilate was stuck in people-pleasing, and the issues we're going to look at are popularity, pessimism, and powerlessness. So the scene takes place in Jerusalem, in the headquarters of the Roman governor. Jesus of Nazareth, the wandering preacher, has been hailed before the authority of Pilate. The governor had the opportunity to do justice, and there is evidence that he really did want to do justice in the situation. But his need to people-please overtook him. And people-pleasing, the first point I want to make, it produces popularity for just a moment, but it mainly breeds contempt. When you're bent on people-pleasing rather than doing what's right, you can't count on the purity, the motives of those you're trying to please. It's very likely that they only want you to do what they want you to do for selfish reasons. So if you buy into people-pleasing, you're never going to see that you're being used. Pontius Pilate had an early morning visit from the Pharisees and the temple officers who'd brought Jesus in for judgment. The text tells us they brought Jesus, but they themselves wouldn't enter Pilate's quarters because they wanted to avoid ritual defilement. The Jewish law, you see, said that living quarters of a non-Jew were unclean, and that if you went into one of their houses but didn't afterwards go through a cleansing ceremony, you were ritually unclean. You therefore weren't able to celebrate the festival if you'd stepped on what they called pagan turf. As I read it, that's quite an insult. Pilate, we want you to do our dirty work. We want you to kill this guy who's causing us a problem, but we're not going to do you the courtesy of stepping inside your home. Pilate, we want you to do what we don't actually have the courage to do, to kill Jesus. We want to use you to get the job done, but we're not going to accord you any dignity. We won't acknowledge you. We don't care how you feel. People-pleasing produces popularity for a moment, but that popularity masks contempt. There's so much talk these days about self-esteem. I'm going to show my age now, but I was listening to Radio 4 in the car the other day, and a documentary came on where they were talking about how charities are now being set up to try and help people to find hope, because they've realized that if you have hope, you have a better life. You're better at your job. You have a better family life. Your self-esteem is better. Hello? And now they're talking about having to put people through counseling and try and doing programs for people to go on to give them more hope. Thousands, millions of people suffer from low self-esteem, and then they act out of that insecurity. The issue about people pleasing is that we do it because we feel inadequate. We feel low. We need the adulation of others just to keep us going. We need so badly to have somebody like us that will do almost anything to please them. But we don't even recognize that they're actually out to do us harm, to put us down. Pontius Pilate never even saw it coming. He never even saw how the Jews were using him because he was so bent on trying to please them. So the first lesson we learn from Pilate, the people pleaser, is that people's devious hearts are going to hurt you if they can. They're going to use you if you can't stand up and do what's right, rather than what's simply popular. So people pleasing, you think it'll make you popular, but it actually breeds contempt. The second danger in people pleasing is that it turns to pessimism. Quite a lot of pessimism about these days, isn't there? And it's difficult not to be pessimistic when you see so much going on in the world. But when you're trying to people please, you're courting popularity, but it creates a sour and cynical attitude when you wonder if there's anything worth standing up for anymore. They played quite a little game with Pontius Pilate, these Pharisees did. They sparred with him over Jesus. Pilate asked, "What's the charge?" They didn't answer directly. They just said, "If he were a criminal, we wouldn't be here," which basically means, "Come on, Pilate, just do what you're told." Pilate tried to wriggle out of it. "Take him and judge him according to your law," but that didn't work either. We're not permitted to put anyone to death. On and on it goes. Pilate making offers, the Jews refusing them. They could smell a people pleaser a mile off. And they knew he was in a difficult position. And they knew that finally they were going to get what they wanted. And then there's Pilate sparring with Jesus. "Are you the king of the Jews? What have you done? So you say you're a king." By the time it was all over, Pilate would turn to Jesus and cry out with a sneer on his face and despair, I'm sure, in his voice, "What is truth?" What is truth? In that question, to which he expected no answer, Pilate reveals exactly what he thinks. He doesn't think there's any truth. He's become completely pessimistic. He tells us he doesn't know what to believe and he doesn't know who to trust. And he doesn't have any idea where to turn for direction or how to put his life together. That sound like many people you know? Many people in society today, people we see on a day-to-day basis, they just don't know where to turn or how to put their lives together. Just like Pilate, they become clueless. And Pilate's become clueless because he's been stuck in people-pleasing. And that eventually leads to not knowing where the truth is at all. So people-pleasing leads to the trap of pessimism. Also, people pleasers make themselves completely powerless. Because when you spend your life just pleasing others, you just lose all your power. All you can do is too little, too late. All you do is you flail around in the little puddle you've made of your life, and you wish you could change it all, but you can't. You're powerless. You're doing too little, too late. The real tragedy of Pontius Pilate is spelt out in the last verses of his story, because he has a conversation with Jesus about power. Pilate, as we heard at the start, got himself this lovely job. Although lots of people didn't want it, it a governor was still a powerful job in the Roman Empire, which actually, from his background, he had no right to have, but he'd managed to get it. He thinks he has power. So Pilate says, "Do you not know that I have the power to release you and power to crucify you?" But, as always, Jesus had an answer ready. "You would have no power over me unless it had been given to you from above." No power. That's really where Pilate is. It's just he doesn't know it yet. He's completely powerless. And wow, do they get him when they cry out, "Pilate, if you release this man, you're no friend of the emperor." Checkmate. Because Pilate then sees his life ending in powerlessness. His political career before his eyes going down the tubes. His pension threatened. His reputation ruined. They knew exactly how to get him, didn't they? Just mention Caesar's name and we'll bring him into line. So simply, starkly, the text says, then he handed Jesus over to them to be crucified. Powerless. Pilate throws up his hands in resignation. We see that he washes his hands. Says, "Fine, I'll wash my hands of this whole situation. People-pleasing has come to this. And if the man Jesus has to be sacrificed, well, so be it. It saves my career." Pilate has to please the people. Pilate has to please the emperor. Pilate is stuck forever in people-pleasing. And there is complete powerlessness. And when it came time to put a banner on the cross, as was the custom, to explain the charge against the criminal, Pilate finally shows what he actually thinks. Because he orders the inscription, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." When they complained about it, he finally stiffens his spine and answers, "What I have written, I have written." And I have to say, it's all very well to stand for something when the deed is done, but this was all too little too late. When you've given away all your power, all very well to take a stand when the battle's already over and you've already lost all your integrity, all your wholeness, all your joy, all your potential. The end result of people-pleasing became powerlessness. The shattered hulk of a man who forever would be remembered in history as the man who handed over Jesus to be crucified, pretending to win a battle that he'd lost hours before. What a tragedy. But in being a people pleaser, what we can see that what Pilate actually does is important for us to remember, because he refuses to stand up for justice. So Proverbs 18:5 says, "It's not good to be partial to the wicked and so deprive the innocent of justice." Pilate's more interested in looking out for his own interests than that of an innocent man. Luke and John tell us that Jesus admits to Pilate that he's the king of the Jews, but that his kingdom is a spiritual kingdom, not a physical or political one. And on hearing that testimony, Pilate goes back out and tells the leaders there's no basis for a trial. Their accusations are not relevant to his court. When Pilate hears that Jesus comes from Galilee, he passes them off to Herod, who rules over that area. Herod very quickly finds no fault, sends him back. Then he tries to let Jesus off with just a beating, but that's not enough to please the crowd. Pilate then goes to the crowd and asks them to choose between Jesus and Barabbas, thinking that surely they would choose an innocent man over a hardened criminal. But much to his dismay, they choose Barabbas. In all of this, Pilate's trying to live up to his wife's request to, quote, to leave that innocent man alone. Pilate knows he's innocent, and he tries every political trick in the book to get Jesus off the charge, or more importantly, to get Pilate off the hook. But instead of then taking a stand for Jesus, when the rubber hits the road, he bows to the will of the crowd. It's so much easier to let others decide a person's fate rather than step up and speak out on others' behalf. And yet, that is exactly what you and me are called to do. Because in Psalm 33:5 it says, "The Lord loves righteousness and justice. The earth is full of his unfailing love." Zechariah 5:9, "This is what the Lord Almighty said, administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to one another." You know what? We need to be taking a stand for the poor, for victims, for those who have no voice, for those society overlooks, and speak out on their behalf and seek justice for them. We need to take a stand for justice and righteousness. Do you find that in your day-to-day life we say a lot of words, but actually when push comes to the shove, when the rubber hits the road, do we just go with the crowd? Do we let the crowd decide? Second, Pilate refuses to seek truth. Jesus says to Pilate, "You say that I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." And we heard that Pilate answers with the question, "What is truth?" And the scriptures say that then with that he went out to the crowd. Right then and there, in that moment, Pilate had the opportunity of a lifetime. He had a discussion with the teacher of all truth that could have guided him in the situation, the immediate situation, and for the rest of his life. But instead, he throws out a philosophical question, a question that shows he hasn't really wrestled with his faith, and he walks out. When Jesus speaks of truth, he's not just talking about any truth or one person's idea of truth or what society says is their current lived truth. But he's talking about the absolute, universal, and unalterable truth. With this, Jesus gave Pilate a tremendous opportunity. An opportunity to stand up and stake his life and position on such a truth, rather than the jaded opinions of the Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, a truth relative to them and only them, which they were trying to impose on others. So when Pilate asked Jesus what is truth, and then he leaves the conversation, he does what loads of us fail to do. And that is think and wrestle with the truth and what we really believe. You know, folks, this morning, what do you really believe? We're here in church. It's something that I've had to think about over the years. I was really fortunate. We talked about testimonies this morning. I've been really fortunate that I've grown up in a Christian home. I do not know a life where Jesus is not in it. So my testimony is partly incredibly boring, but also one of how wonderful it is to grow up in a Christian home. But over the years, I've had to wrestle with, is this what I believe, or have I just picked up what my parents believe? Is this what I think, or is this what I know my dad always used to think? Folks, this morning, what do you believe? Have you really wrestled with it? Too many Christians today are failing to put in the work, to not only seek truth, but to really think about what they believe, why they believe it, and what makes it truth. Not just truth for them, but truth for all people, in all circumstances and in all times. Because I fear that these days, and I used to work at UCB, and it's a great organisation, and they do lots of good things, but there's so many great media organisations and things these days. We get spoon-fed our faith. Folks can just come into church and they can hear the word. We can turn on the telly. We can read books. We can be spoon-fed our faith and told what to believe. But we don't do the hard work, and I'm as guilty as everybody else, of wrestling with our own faith and deciding what we believe and why we believe it. I greatly admire people who believe in other faiths. and none. There's a comedian on the television who occasionally I've caught things with him on because he's just the kind of comedian that as a Christian I shouldn't be watching. And he's definitely not a Christian. But I was intrigued that on a program a while ago I watched, they started talking about the Bible, and his knowledge of the Bible was impeccable. But he doesn't believe a word of it, but he knows exactly what it says. And when we come up against people from other faiths and we have to talk about why we're a Christian, and we have to say why we know the Bible is the truth, are we sure we could do that? Because I'll tell you for something, they'll know exactly why they believe they're right. And they know our Bible. It's so much easier to just accept what we're told to believe or what we think makes sense rather than really putting it to the test. Thirdly, Pilate fails to make a decision for Christ because he's had an encounter here with the truth, the way, the truth, and the life. And the truth always demands a response. Pilate brought more and more truth to bear on his conscience. Jesus answered those questions by talking about the real source of authority, which is God, not Caesar. Jesus had talked to Pilate about the nature of his kingdom, a kingdom not from this world but from heaven above. He talked with him about two kinds of people, those on the side of truth and those in opposition to truth. Pilate progressively realizes that there's something highly unusual about Jesus. And we, in turn, must recognize that Jesus gives us the same opportunity. Will we respond like Pilate and flippantly challenge the entire notion of truth? Or will we embrace that which is absolute and unalterable, regardless of our denials and efforts to redefine truth? Jesus presents us with a decision. Are we going to decide to believe in him and follow in his footsteps, seeking to live a life just like him? Or are we just going to stay on the fringes, continue to be a fan of Jesus rather than a follower? You'll see a fan of Jesus stays in the seats or on the sidelines, never gets involved in the game. Often perhaps has a very strong opinion about how everything should be done. I often listen to 606 or Talk Sport on a Saturday evening. In fact, my girls get so fed up with it. And you'll have all the fans ringing in after the Saturday afternoon's football, and you know they could have managed the team a lot better than the guy who was out there. And he should have put this player on at half-time, and he should have taken this one off, and I'm sure if my granny was on the pitch, she'd have scored it. But they're a fan. They haven't actually had to do any of the hard work. They haven't had to get their hands dirty. A guy called Kyle Adelman writes, a fan is an enthusiastic admirer, but Jesus is never interested in enthusiastic admirers. He wants completely committed followers. He wants more from us than a raised hand or a prayer repeated at the end of the service. He's looking for more than a prayer before a meal and a Jesus fish on the back of your car while you're cutting someone up. I added that bit in. He wants more than fans. He wants followers who take up a cross and die to themselves. So let's remember, fans never fully commit. And being a fan means you're never fully committed to Jesus, but instead you're just content, coming to church, worshipping, but not living focused on the mission, the values, and the heart of God. Pilate's dilemma then is ours today. Are we going to stay on the sidelines? Are we going to listen to truth and then throw up our arms and walk out of the room and put the decision to the crowd? Are we going to make a decision, accept the call of his life, and become a proper follower? Like Pilate, We've got to answer two questions this morning, and I want to leave you with these. Who is Jesus? Is he just a good man, so there's no reason to commit to him? We can, like Pilate, think he's a good man with no charge against him. Acknowledge him as King of the Jews. But when it's not in our interest, when it might harm us in some way, when it's inconvenient, we just throw him to the crowd to please them. Or is he who he said he was, said he is? The Son of God who died in my and your place. And if I believe the latter, then why wouldn't I give my life to him wholly and completely? And once we decide who Jesus is, we've got to answer Pilate's question. What will I do with this Jesus? Will we try to evade him and thus make the decision to stay as a fan, uncommitted on the sidelines? Or will I surrender to him as the Lord and director of my life? Will you decide to please people or obey God? Will you decide to please people or follow Christ? Or maybe you're thinking, but James, I'm a believer this morning. I've made a commitment. You know God, you know you're a Christian, but maybe you also know you're trying to be popular, only to find contempt. You've tried to be what people want you to be, only you've now become incredibly pessimistic. You don't know what truth is anymore. You're throwing up your arms like Pilate, just saying, what is truth? Maybe you find yourself living without power. You're living without victory, living only what others want you to live. Then choose Christ this morning. Christ who loves you for yourself, Christ who will never abandon you. Choose to please not what other people say, but choose Christ who teaches you all truth and who I guarantee will never fail. Choose Christ who will give you all the power you need. So that's the question this morning. Are we going to be stuck in people-pleasing? Or are we going to find power in the living Christ? I'm going to leave you with a quote from a guy called James Stewart. No, not that one. He wrote The Life and Teachings of Jesus Christ. And he said this: everyone who studies this narrative has the strange feeling that the tables are being turned before their very eyes, and that what they are seeing is not Jesus on trial before the crowd, but Pilate on trial before Jesus. In fact, as Pilate stands with the Son of God in those hours, it is as if Jesus' searchlight is probing his soul, revealing his true character for all the world to see. But every soul will stand where Pilate stood at some time in their life, face to face with Jesus in the place of decision. Thank you very much.